Hi, friends. Welcome. This is session two of our junior night series. Thanks for being here. What colleges are looking for? Right now, tonight, we've got Calvin. Calvin's going to tell us what every single college ever that has ever existed is going to be looking for from here into eternity, and specifically what you need to do. No, I'm kidding. Um, we're delighted to invite Calvin from Johns Hopkins. He's the Deputy Dean of Admission. I'll let him introduce himself just a little bit more in just a second. You've met me before. I'm Ethan. I'm the college essay guy. I spend a goodly part of my day thinking about how to create more free resources for y'all. And Tom, do you want to just introduce yourself real quick? And then we'll let Calvin introduce himself and we'll go.
Sure. Yeah. So for those of you who are new to College Essay Guy, welcome. Nice to meet you. For those of you who are returners, we're glad you're back. My name's Tom Campbell. I use he, him pronouns. I've been working at College Essay Guy full time for 3 years, doing lots of stuff that Ethan mentioned. But prior to that, my background is in college admissions and college counseling. So I spent a total of 6 years working in admissions at Holy Cross and Pomona College, and also worked as a college counselor at an independent school in Seattle. So the sun and the PNW. I know it's rare, and I live in California now. There's a method to my madness. So happy to be here with you all. Yeah, thanks so much.
Calvin, feel free to do your background bio in whatever way you want. I really mean that.
Yeah, and I'll keep it brief. Yeah, I serve as the Deputy Dean of Admissions at Johns Hopkins University. What that means is I oversee our undergraduate admissions operations. I've been at Hopkins for it'll be 14 years this August, which seems crazy. It's blown
Wow.
by. And a lot has changed in those 14 years, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And I started my admissions career at St. Mary's College here in Maryland, a small regional public. And so started at a small public here in the state and moved up, up closer to Baltimore to be at Hopkins. I'm from the Baltimore area. I always say that, I was born, raised, educated, and employed all in the great state of Maryland. So as most Maryland folks and Marylanders, we love our state, we love our flag. But I'm happy to be here. This is what I enjoy. This is what keeps me going in this work, being able to provide some insights and some perspectives and help you all kind of sort through all the noise out there around college admissions to hopefully provide some clarity.
Awesome. I'm really grateful you're here. And I want to just say to everybody, if you got questions, we're going to do our best to do it. Feel free to throw them in the chat. Not in the chat, sorry, the Q&A box. We probably won't address like, hey, my son got a 1370 on the SAT. Like the really specific ones, we're probably going to skip over those. We're going to probably prize those questions that we think other folks might be interested in. So just planting that seed for y'all. But I'd love to start with the question of like, people are always looking at trends and it's really hard to like go like, I don't know, nationally, at least for me, to be like, here's what's changing in college admission. But
Yeah.
I do have some appetite for that, and I sense some folks do. So I'd love to just know, like from your perspective, I mean, you've been doing this a while. Was there anything that you feel like was different this year, or anything that surprised you?
Um, I think that what surprised me. I mean, I think every year things are different, things are changing, things are evolving. And so I think I'm always surprised at what's how things are changing within our field and within our work. There's large conversations I'm sure we'll get into around standardized testing, around merit, and how we're looking at academics and grade inflation and how students are really spending their time. So I think that there's been a lot that has kind of surprised me as we've gone on. We are in the process right now. Before I hopped on this call, we are in the throes of committee. Selection committee is kind of the last stage, looking at the most competitive students to figure out who are the most compelling ones for admission. And even though I've been doing this for 16, 17 years, I still am surprised about just how amazing these kids are. And unfortunately, the hardest part of my job is I can't admit them all. And I know they're going to go off and do amazing things, but I guess that still continues to just wow me as I'm, continue to work in this field.
Will you, to whatever extent you're able, will you kind of take us behind the scenes just a minute and like what's happening in those committee reviews? What are the conversations you're happening? Even if you can get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of like how that works.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do like a quick 30-second PSA as well to couch some things before I dive in. I do want to recognize, and you joked earlier, Ethan, about me being able to provide all the answers to all the things for all the colleges. I mean, that's a joke, but also true, right? The beauty of higher education system in America is there's a degree, there's a pathway to a bachelor's degree for everybody, right? There's probably about 4,000 of those, colleges and universities. But the flip side of that coin is that we all do it a little differently. And so there's a lot of variance in regards to what colleges are looking for. I try to broaden as much as possible. And obviously I work at a selective private institution. So I can definitely speak to that. And so I do want to kind of acknowledge kind of the space that I come from, to make sure that you all understand that it does differ depending on where you're going, what the institutions are, what they're looking for. We practice what's called holistic admissions review, which is context-driven, individualized, and evidence-based. So what that means is we're digging into what more than just the numbers, right? So as a for instance, and to kind of answer your question directly, Ethan, at Hopkins, we're close to 50,000 applications this year. Our incoming class is 1,300. I'm also a very practical person when I present, Ethan. I don't know if you know that about me, right? So what comes with that is a highly selective process. Where we are now, all the students that we're reviewing, they are tremendous. They have done well from a quantitative standpoint, and throughout high school. They are all going to go off and do amazing things. But we could fill our incoming class 10 times over with students who make that profile, right? I don't want to kind of overshadow the fact that there is an academic bar, right? We are looking for students who have thrived, have done well in high school. And I think sometimes when you talk to selective institutions, we do end up talking more about the qualitative aspects in our process that feel oftentimes subjective. And I don't want that to overshadow, the basic academic criteria we're looking for. So where we are now, we're not talking about what GPA does this kid have, right? I'm having conversations of, is there evidence of intellectual curiosity? Is there evidence of love of learning? Talk to me about how this student took advantage of the opportunities at their high school. How does that correspond with the academic area of interest, right? If you tell me you want to be an engineer, hopefully you're doing well in physics, right? I don't want to stand on the bridge of an engineer that failed physics, right? Like I think there's that added layer. And so that's where we're spending our time. We're sitting around, we're virtual now through committee. We're sitting around in groups of 3 to 6, having these really robust conversations about these students, trying to figure out who's going to make it to the next round.
And even more, again, to whatever extent we can, I want to kind of like pinch and zoom. So you're in a room, you're in a virtual room, 3 people. You've each got, I'm guessing, the student's application in front of you. And what are the sort of things you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to just get a little bit more of like, what are sort of the things that you're looking at when it's sort of like that, those cases where you're sort of like, this student is maybe they're admissible, they've got all the things, but like, what are you looking for there?
Yeah, we also have what's called a regional model in our office. So we kind of carve up the world and everybody has a region. The regional officer is the one who's supposed to bring that context into the committee conversation, right? So they are familiar with the high schools. All high schools come with a school profile that gives us a little bit of, it's like a legend to understand the transcript, what's offered at the high school, a little bit about the community. So that's where that context-driven process is coming from. We're not judging student at school A versus student at school B, right? It's not that type of evaluation. We look at it individually, the student where they are. So that person's presenting out the file and they're presenting out a summary, right? So that regional officer's job, what we were doing the past few months, is really synthesizing the full application down into kind of an overview to present out kind of, here is the student. We digest that. And then we start navigating and digging into the file, right? So every person is different and kind of what really makes them stand out in the process. We publicize this on our website. We're looking at academic character. We're looking at a student's impact in the overall initiative within their community, and then overall match for the institution, right? So we have students who showcase high level of academic character, students that are making a significant impact within their community, whether that's their school, their home, their faith-based community, what have you. And then we're also looking at match, right? 1,300 students, they all can't be the same. They can't be a homogenous group of, all students who play the trombone, right? So we're looking at how students' experiences and backgrounds and skill sets are going to match and mesh with everybody else. So that's where we kind of weave our conversation around those 3 pillars. to figure out and land. We vote and land and as we make a decision on who's going to move on.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing these specifically. And for folks who are maybe, I don't know, listening in their car or something, in the chat, I put a link to the specific page that says, here's what we look for at Hopkins. This is like the what we look for page. That, I mentioned this to you before we got on, but Tom and I spent some time looking broadly at like a big list of schools to see can we find some of those qualities that are in common? Intellectual curiosity, like you mentioned, was one of the big ones that came up. Impact and initiative is another one that came up as, one of these qualities. And I'd love to just get in on that one for just a second and ask a question of like, what is it that you think students sometimes get wrong about impact and initiative? Like something like oftentimes students think about it as X, but actually, like, yeah, fill that out for us.
Yeah, I mean, when I was going to college, there was this idea out there that you had to be well-rounded. That's what everybody talked about when it's about community. So, like, what did I do? Like, I played a sport, played basketball, I played in the jazz band, I did community service, right? And I checked those boxes. That's a well-rounded kid. Um, Now I hear more of still some well-rounded, but now it's like you have to kind of have a spike. You have to have a well-defined thing that's like your jam, right?
Right.
And neither one of those are necessarily true, right? I think there are both misconceptions around that. Our incoming class has to be well-rounded, but that doesn't mean every individual student has to be well-rounded. And some kids are 16 and 17. We don't expect you to have these well-defined passions. I want you to care about things. I want you to think deeply about your community and how you can make an impact. What I left out of my application, I told you about some of the things I was involved in. I didn't include that I had significant family responsibilities within my application.
Mhm.
I didn't include that I worked at the movie theater and I was actually employee of the month 1 month, right? Like, so when you think about impact, I was making an impact in my family. Both my parents worked a lot. I was helping out my younger brother, right? I was making an impact at the movie. I loved that job, right? I cared a lot about that. I was excited to go on the Fridays and Saturdays during the big rush, being back in concessions and talking to people and making sure that popcorn was fresh, right? I cared a lot about that, but I didn't share those things because I thought that colleges didn't care about that. So what I would say, and I've been trying to reiterate, is that we care about what you care about. We don't have like a prescribed list of things that we're looking for in regards to activities. Um, and we're thinking about, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are thinking about how those things are going to translate to our campus. So, yes, I went away to college and I wasn't at home helping my brother, but I saw myself as, some of those skills translate to helping my classmates and my roommates. Like we're building these learning communities. And so, focus on what you have learned out of those experiences. What are you taking away from those experiences? Because that's what we're going to hone in as we're thinking about it in our process.
Yeah. Another one, is another one of the sort of like we call them admission nutrients, like things that we think are qualities to like not only qualities that colleges are looking for, but qualities that are going to just lead to like a more meaningful life. And a big one kind of connected to this is like service to others.
Mhm.
So I'd love to, have you talk about that one a minute. Like, what is it that when quote unquote colleges, but let's just talk about Hopkins, like is looking at service to others. Is there anything in that realm that you feel like there are any misconceptions about or sort of myths to bust?
Yeah, yeah. And I started talking about this earlier. I've done some work with the National Honor Society, and service is one of their pillars. And I've read for their scholarship, and I've also like done some programming with them around this idea of service. And I think there is a lot of misconceptions, because of how some schools are structured, where you need X amount of service hours. I think there's a fixation on the numeric, the quantitative, and kind of the checking of the box if I've done that, and not necessarily like what was the impact of that service, right? Students will ask me, "Do you care about community services?" And I'll tell them, "I only care about it if you care about it, right?" And what you've gotten out of that experience, And I always encourage students, if it's service, how you spend your summer. Don't do something because you think this is going to make my college application stronger. Do it because it's something that you're interested in and that you care about, because that's what's going to translate in our process, right? How you talk about those experiences is what we care about, not that you're just doing them. And so when you're thinking about service to others, yes, we are a residential college community at Hopkins. We are admitting not only classmates, but roommates and teammates and individuals that are going to bump into each other on the pathway. Those that have been to college know those are the things that you remember most, those interactions with other people, right? And service is one way that we can see how those students may interact with those around them.
Mhm. Well, another one of the qualities that you mentioned, you talked about running into people, creating a community. Another one of the qualities that comes up a lot is collaboration. And I
Mhm.
just love to hear you talk a little bit about that, about why is collaboration important to a college admission reader, and
Yeah.
what are some of the ways that it shows up at Hopkins? Like, what are some ways
Yeah.
that students are going to be expected to collaborate with one another?
Yeah, I think this is also important to, understand institutional mission, right? If you think of, so Hopkins, we're the nation's first research institution, and our mission is to solve the world's most difficult problems, right? So collaboration is incredibly important to us because we feel that um, you cannot solve the world's problems unless you are leveraging the strengths of other people, right? And as a matter of fact, our supplemental essay a few years back was about collaboration. Now we
Um,
kind of moved away from that, especially during the pandemic, where students felt it was harder to
yeah,
collaborate with others. There was a lot of collaboration that was happening, but it's important. It's important to institutions. That's specific to Hopkins about our mission and why we care so much about that. But I think that what's difficult for students, and I was there in high school, is that they haven't had a lot of positive collaborative experiences, right? The failed group project is a common one, right? And I was there, right? Somebody's not pulling your weight and you have to do all the work, right? So I think it's hard for students to understand kind of where collaboration can be at its best, and but when it is at its best, it's amazing. We see that kind of happening on our campus every day, and so I think that thinking about what do you think is the purpose of collaboration? The purpose isn't everybody kind of divvying up work and getting something done. The spirit of it is like, how do we tap into and leverage everybody's skill sets and experiences and perspectives to make our work better? And I think there are lots of ways that you can think about that in your personal life, within your family, within clubs and organizations, within schoolwork. So I encourage you to kind of reflect on that a little bit.
I love the point you're making, because I think that students oftentimes think collaboration looks like one particular thing. Like it's
Yeah.
just that group project, or it's just that, I'm that officer in that one club and that's how I'm working with others. But I think that I love the point you're making about how with families, and you mentioned work. I worked in high school. I worked at, started at 15 and working at McDonald's. Like that was collaboration, that was so some of
Yeah.
those cases I think could be really powerful. And I've read, essays where students are writing about working at In-N-Out or, you know, talk to me about intellectual curiosity a little bit, because I think that I'd love to hear, are there any examples that you can think of sort of like intellectual curiosity that stayed with you over the years? Because I think sometimes it gets, I don't know, I imagine that students sort of think, well, intellectual curiosity means you have to go and do like some big internship or research
Mhm.
project or something like that. But I don't
Yeah.
know, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but can you think of any examples of like intellectual curiosity that have been, interesting, meaningful, surprising to you over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I encounter them every day. I mean, I think that it's important to highlight those that are not kind of like these big splash events. But I read letters of recommendation from teachers that talk about students who come across really interesting material and they come after class and are chatting with the teacher about it, right? I read examples of students who are in class working on group projects and they really elevate the conversation right around whatever the group project is about, right? I come across students where they just find something that is really interesting and they're doing research online, they're watching videos, and to us, intellectual curiosity, a love of learning, and showcasing that yes, you can go do an internship at a engineering firm, and that's one way to showcase it, or you can just be watching YouTube videos about rocketry, right? And that's a way that you're showcasing your love of learning and intellectual curiosity. I think the other thing I want to note, because I get a lot of questions about this, is this whole idea of undecided. I think that it's a detriment to students that we oftentimes expect them to know what they want to do or who they want to be at 16 and 17 years of age. I think that's a huge disservice for two reasons. One, if there are parents on the call, they will probably tell you they're not doing exactly what they thought they were going to do when they were 16 or 17. And then two, that's just not the way the world works. It didn't work now when we were growing up. And it definitely doesn't work now. Now, as a matter of fact, our career center is called the Life Design Lab, and I won't get into too much detail, but we've kind of reframed outcomes after college, with the expectation that you're going to have different jobs and careers, and you're going to be leaders in fields that haven't been created yet. And so our goal is to, in 4 years, create a toolkit, right, for you to be able to pivot and move as things evolve. And so it's not about a kid saying, I want to study computer science. I've wanted to do this for my whole life.
Mhm.
Here are some examples of how I've done that, but more of like, where does that interest come from? Like, what
Right.
topics are you interested in as it relates to computer science? Like, and how are you thinking about that? And getting me excited to understand how you're going to take advantage of that when you come to my campus. You're really interested in the ethical considerations around AI. Awesome. Like, we have whole departments and centers and world-renowned faculty in that. You don't have to have done it yet. That's what we're here for. We're the college, right? We're the catalyst for that, And so we don't expect you to be, that well-polished diamond, right? But we want some kernels of how we can connect the dots to help us understand how you're going to take advantage of our community.
I love what you're saying here. And you're touching on the fifth of these like nutrients, as it were, this consistent engagement. And consistent engagement, what I hear you saying is like it can look like a lot of different things. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean like I've known from day one,
Yeah.
I've wanted to do this, this, and this. Like you said, I've been interested in this particular thing for a while, and being able to sort of track that progression
Hmm.
just seems really important.
Yeah.
And engagement. Well, let's. I mean, I'm going to ask you, like, when you think about an engaged student, like, what is that? What do you? Where does that show up in the application? And again, what I'm trying to do is sort of, you can tell I'm kind of trying to push out sort of like beyond our typical conceptions of what we
Right.
think the right answer is, but like, yeah, what does consistent engagement look like for you?
Yeah, for me, it looks like students who are um, trying to take advantage of opportunities that are available to them, and that looks different for everybody, right? There are some schools that have high schools that have 100 different clubs and organizations and all these things, and students have a lot of robust opportunities, and other schools don't have that, or students are homeschooled, and their high school experience looks differently, and so there's not a one size fits all, but we're looking for students who are demonstrating that and are seeking out opportunities. I think that's a big thing. And I think that what really resonates with us is when students are thoughtful about that, right? For instance, I have a fourth grader, and he has to do something. Oh, cool! A service project, and he's like, "Okay, I gotta do this service project. Why don't I donate some clothes?" And I'm like, "Okay, we could do that, but like, why do you want to donate clothes? Like, what do you actually care about? What are some of the things that you see around you that are actually interesting to you?" And he's like, "Well, the lot behind our school is dirty, and I just feel like the trash is a problem." And I'm like, "Okay." And again, he's in the 10th grade. That's why I feel like, it's not an unfair expectation to ask kids to look around them. And I'm like, "All right, well, let's do, we could do a cleanup and some recycling, and let's dig into why this is actually the case." So I think that process of really connecting to what you care about and seeking out opportunities to match that's what resonates with the college community, not just someone who's just like doing things because they feel like they need to get them done.
Right. Yeah, I love the point you're making about like, students who are looking at opportunities close by and trying to
Hmm.
solve a problem.
Yep. Hmm.
I feel you. You mentioned AI, so I can't not ask you, but like, what are you seeing in terms of Chat GPT? We didn't talk about this offline, but the college essay guy's got to know, like, in terms of what are the conversations happening inside the office, and what are you noticing in terms of essays, as it relates to AI, Chat GPT, use?
Yeah, I mean, and this has just been my mantra over the past 10 years. I try not to pendulum swing as much as possible. I think that we have a tendency as a society to swing really far, and sometimes that can cause an overreaction, and just trying to be really measured and prudent in how we think about things. I was on a panel with John Bokenstadt about a year ago out of, he's now retired at Oregon State. And we were asked about AI, and this is when ChatGPT really blew up. And he was on the panel and he said, "I remember when the TI-83 calculator came out, and everybody said that kids won't be able to do math." And I'm sitting on the panel, I was like, "Why? I use that. And I think my math abilities are fine, right?" And he was like, I think that that was interesting to note that we have these advancements in technology, that scare us a little bit. And then we have to figure out where we land with it and how to ethically navigate it. I think we've moved to a space where at least, there are ways that colleges are looking at authenticity in the application and making sure that students are putting forth work that is of their own, and representing their own experiences. However, the technology, at least available to us from ChatGPT when it comes to essays, you read those essays, and let me also be clear, I think that this issue existed before AI generative technology. Sometimes we get essays from students that we can tell have been overworked by outside people,
Yeah.
right? Whether that's an essay consultant or a parent, and it loses its voice. And that might seem strange to you all, but when you read tens of thousands of applications over X amount of years, you're able to gather a voice from an application, and from an essay of a student that really personifies and gives you a good image. And I've been talking a lot about how we visualize and place students on campus. The voice is a big part of that. And you can tell either maybe the student used ChatGPT or someone's really overworked the essay, that it's lost that voice. And that essay is just not going to land well with us, right?
Right.
It doesn't have a soul, And so I feel like we're at a point where I think people understand what I'm talking about now at this point, especially if they've used some of that. There are a lot of schools high schools that are working with students and the ethical way to use AI technology, which I think is great. I don't think we should be running away from the technology. I think we need to discuss what are the ethical ways of using it.
Mhm.
Um, but that's just my advice when it comes to essays, right? Like, I don't know sometimes if the kid used ChatGPT, and sometimes I do, or if someone else really helped them out. But I do know this essay is not helping them in the process, right? And that's what I want to kind of really drive home.
One of the things that people say with ChatGPT is there's sort of like a question about like our essay is going to go away. And, it's something that I'm curious about in terms of how Hopkins uses
Yeah,
essays, uses the personal statement, in particular the supplemental essay prompt. So, I mean,
yeah,
I'm not going to put you on the spot and be like, are your supplements changing? But I am curious, I want to read last year's supplemental essay prompt because it's one that a lot of colleges are asking
yeah.
about. And and I think after the SCOTUS decision, a lot more colleges added supplemental essays. So I'm going to read it out loud and I want to just hear your take on it. So it says, how has your life experience contributed to your personal story, your character, values, perspectives, or skills, and what you want to pursue at Hopkins?
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear maybe just a little bit about the thinking for that prompt, and also where do students, do you feel like, go wrong when they're trying to answer this question? Because it's a common one. Like this is one that's become one of the most popular prompts along with like the why us essay.
Yeah, I mean, I always say I think the supplemental essay is as important, if not more important, than the personal statement because of the third pillar, right, of our process, which is about match for our institution. I think that's the most common misconception in college admissions, is that we go about this rewarding past success, right? This student did well in high school. Congratulations. Here's your admissions letter. That's not selective admissions. We're trying to predict future potential, and more specifically, your future potential on our college campus. And the supplemental essay is your explicit opportunity to lay out that future potential on our campus from your perspective. So it is very important, the supplemental essay. Um, uh, Couple of things. One, it is two-part, right? When you read that, it is an aspect of you as the individual, your background experiences, um, and then it's us. So I think sometimes students don't do both,
Mhm.
right? They talk a lot about them and they don't connect to us, or they talk a lot about us and they don't really bring out those pieces of themselves. So I think that's a really important thing to note, as well as for you to really be able to, you would really have to work chat gpt to get it to a point where you're inputting a bunch of stuff about kind of who you are and your personal story to get it to a point where it gets personal in a way that we're looking for that within the essay. And so I that's for me, I think that's probably the hardest essay to leverage something else for. Success in creating that essay, I think self-reflection is the most important aspect of this process. That is important for college search, which I think is actually more important than actually getting in. I always tell students, you ask me a lot of questions about how to get into college, but like, what happens when you get here? I'm a first generation college student. That was the biggest misstep for me. I
Yeah.
didn't really think too much about the college experience, right? But self-reflecting, what am I looking for, and who am I, right? What things have shaped my perspective, and doing some research for the college and kind of what how that connects. The last thing I'll say about the supplement, and this is a tip for you as you're going through the process, usually you get to the supplement kind of towards the end. You've done your search, you've identified schools, you started applying, you're putting your essays together, you're working on something. If you get to the supplemental essay and you're having a hard time really answering basically like why us, or what are you hoping to get out of this college experience, like you've missed some things, some steps in this process, right? You need to go back and do your research, right? So if you're struggling with those supplements, they get at who we are as an institution and what we're looking for. So for you to be successful, you have to have researched that and really understand that who we are as institutions. And so that's a tip I would say in regards to trying to make a really compelling supplemental essay.
I love that. Yeah, the couple things that you're saying that really resonating. One is like what I say to students sometimes is like it's amazing how much research a student will do on which headphones to buy
Yeah.
versus which colleges are going to apply to. A kid will spend 8 hours, and I've been that kid, trying to figure out is it but and yet here's where you're going to spend the next 4 years of your life.
Yeah.
The other thing that's popping into my head is like in the pendulum swing thing. You mentioned you played basketball. I played basketball too, and I'm hearing Dwayne Wade's words when he was in the locker room one time, and they were like, how is it going? This is like right after the Miami, after they got there, and he was like, don't get too high, don't get too low. He was like, keeping it right in the middle. So that's spoke the not immortal, but the words of Dwayne Wade there. So Tom had a question because some of the supplemental essays are related to institutional priorities, and rather than ask his question, Tom, what would you take this one? What was the question that you were having around institutional priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think institutional priorities in general is something that I was really surprised, kind of like you maybe, like when you haven't worked in admissions and you think like all these things, like for me, it was like, oh, I need to get a rec letter from like a math teacher and a history teacher because I need to show that I'm well-rounded. And now I realize I'm like misguided. I think for me, institutional priorities and how heavy-handed they can be, particularly at these more selective schools, places where you have 50,000 apps for 1,000 spots. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak, candidly to what that's looked like for you and how that's ebbed and flowed in the 14 years that you've been at Hopkins, because we know priorities don't stay the same. They're a moving target, and predicting them or planning an application to fit them for a school is not really a thing you can do.
Yeah,
Sorry, and for folks who have no idea, because I just jumped in without the term, will you, Calvin, tell folks what institutional priorities are, and then I want to hear your take.
Yeah. And I think there's a few definitions of institutional priorities, and I'll give you some 4 instances to anchor it. But basically, institutions have things that they are looking for, and there are characteristics that we may outline. Like I've talked about some of those, intellectual curiosity and impact and things like that. And there are just like structural things that colleges kind of have to meet, right? Like some colleges have different schools, the School of Nursing, the School of Business, the School of Engineering. So it's a priority to make sure that those programs are robust, right? They're starting a new program. They have a new theater space. They have a new major, right? Those have become priorities because those are things that need to be filled, and we're large enterprises, right, on these colleges. So colleges, will avail themselves. They'll talk about those things like, hey, we are adding a new. I have a friend of mine who coaches an institution, was single sex and now it's co-ed, and now they're adding a basketball program and a soccer program. Best believe that institutions is going to care about recruiting some basketball and some soccer kids. They've committed to this, right? And so that's a priority for the institution. There are things like at Hopkins, we are opening our Agora Institute, which is our home for studying global democracy and civil discourse. So, and our President Daniels, has wrote a lot about the future of democracy, which is a hot topic, in our country and around the world. So you best believe we were thinking about how can we bring students from different types of ideological viewpoints to engage them on our campus. That's a priority for us. That's an institutional priority for us, right? Thinking about that, right? So there are lots of different ways we think about that, from beds. 1,300 students, that's a priority. If I have 10 more, I'm in trouble. If I have 20 less, I'm in trouble, right? There are lots of different ways you can think about these institutional priorities and how they play out. Some are very static and some are very dynamic, right? I don't know what my next year's class, our next year's applicant pool is going to look like, right? I am talking to, we had a large prospective student program last week, right? I can tell you kind of here's some of the things that we are looking for, but they may change as we go into next year or as we kind of dig into the application pool. There's some characteristics that we feel like are missing from our learning community. Can we go back and identify some of those students that have those? I think those are the ones that you don't want to try to chase when you're trying to align yourself with a college, because no one's going to be able to tell you with certainty, what that's going to be. But there are some very attend an information session of a college. Spend some time on their website. They will tell you what they care about. They will promote things that they are trying to build. And you can use that to inform your process.
Yeah, it's so funny that you bring that up about the information sessions, college programming, because it is so true that, as Ethan and I mentioned, right, colleges do often put their value qualities, what they look for, like Hopkins does. Like we've mentioned, MIT, Caltech, they have a particularly robust list of examples of these are qualitative things we actually seek out in your application somewhere. We had a student one time at Pomona who her application came in, and I remember one of my colleagues was like, she must have gone to every single webinar and session that we all attended, because it was like as if it was early decision student, just made for us. So it's amazing when you see that. Something you touched on kind of with the Agora Center, I think you said, is the impact of academic priorities at colleges. And increasingly, we're in a landscape where lots of students are, if you look at kind of major trends and trends in programming, there's a lot of kind of reaching towards certain high in demand majors. And colleges are wondering how to reckon with, we have all these departments and programs, some of which are new and some of which are new to us, but still important. I guess if you could speak a little bit more to academic balance, and you don't have to get so into the weeds, but just how students who are wondering, if I'm looking for some of those more in demand majors, I often tell students, if you Google best majors or best colleges for X major, any of the ones that are on the top list for something like medicine, imagine Hopkins is probably pretty up there. What do you do, if that's the path that you want to pursue, essentially? How do you position yourself strategically or wisely with your list and with your everything?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to something that Ethan mentioned about the research, and I think that's just so true about the the headphones and really digging into that. And I'll use science as an example. I'll use biology as an example, right? Most colleges offer a biology major, but students oftentimes don't spend some time. We all have similar majors and names, and sometimes the names are different, but the courses and the opportunities differ. So I think going to a college's department's websites to really understand the offerings, the pedagogy, all that stuff about that program, that's going to help you be able to make a stronger case when we are thinking about the match for that student, right? As a matter of fact, you're not even going to come to Hopkins, at least undergrad, to become a doctor. Pre-med is not a major. So if you tell me you want to study pre-med here, you can be pre-med as an advisory track, but what are you going to learn? What major are you going to pursue? What type of academic experience, right? That's the level of specificity and the research that students should be doing to understand that. Yes, there are very competitive programs out there, STEM programs, computer science. At some schools, they're like, we're not even admitting first-year students. You have to come here, and prove yourself for a year. We do direct admit into that. But you would imagine there are lots of people who are applying to those institutions, to those programs. And yes, they're going to be competitive at certain places depending on how that institution does their admissions. We try to be as transparent as possible. So I think asking questions. I am interested in computer science at your school. What do you think I need to know? Do specific teachers have to submit my letters of recommendation, or you may be test optional for admissions, but are you test optional for my program? I think asking very specific questions of admissions officers will help you get at what they're looking for.
Yeah, I want to give folks some really specific examples of this, because the thing that you're talking about I think is really important. And for students who are listening and who are maybe, coming up on application time, well, whatever, in 6 months, I think it's useful to give a couple examples, because it seems to me for example, the Hopkins supplemental essay is representative of a lot of essays. And it seems like I call this a double research essay, because there's research inwardly to figure out what you're looking for, who you are, what do you need. And then there's research that's not going to exist in your head about what is Hopkins or Cornell or insert school actually providing. And the magic is sort of like finding those overlaps, that the Venn diagram in the middle. So let me just I want to just take a second to give a couple examples because students can be like, what is he even talking about? So like in this essay, for example, this student he starts off in his Cornell. This is sort of like a why us, but it's similar to the Hopkins one where it's like, why is the depth, breadth, and flexibility of the Cornell curriculum ideally suited to exploring the areas of study that excite you? So again, two parts, the curriculum and then you. This student starts his whole essay, I'm not going to read it, but he starts off talking about how he's interested in the brain. And then he says, as someone who's long been passionate about neurotechnology, I appreciate Cornell is unique in offering classes devoted specifically to the field. So it's like, here's something specific the school is offering that is different from other schools that I'm applying to. Here's a professor whose research isn't being done anywhere else in the world, and it's connected to stuff that I'm into. So I'm not telling you on this call, every student needs to go find 16 things that Hopkins does that's different from every other school, because but if you can find, this is just like a little soapbox moment for me, if you can find one or two things that really set the school apart from other schools you're applying to and that really deeply connect to a thing that you're into, like that's what we're looking for. That's what what colleges are trying to do, trying to get at. I would be a bad interviewer if I didn't talk about the Dear Colleague letter. So just to pivot quick, but I'm curious. So just to give context for folks, we're recording this on February 27th. February 14th, the Department of Education sends this letter to colleges that is sort of, in some sense, expands the scope in some ways of like the Supreme Court decision to ban race-conscious admission. So in case you missed it, anybody watching this, the Supreme Court, said, colleges can't consider race in the college admission process as a standalone factor. But there was a thing in there that said, hey, if you do talk about race or your culture and you're able to connect it to qualities of character, then, there are situations, there was sort of like a little bit of room where students could potentially talk about, how race, culture, how that's influenced who they are and what they're bringing to a college campus. I'm curious, in this letter that was written to all these colleges saying basically, hey, well, I mean, I'll let folks read it for themselves, but I'm curious to hear what was y'all's reaction to it, and what are the conversations that are happening among college representatives around other college admission officers?
Yeah, and I mean, there are a number of executive orders and things that are kind of swirling about in our current administration. I just want to broaden a little bit. I mean, I think one of the things that, or maybe trends to kind of go back to your question earlier, since I've been at admissions, admissions is in the news a lot more than when I first started. And we spend a lot of time with our general counsel really understanding the law. Like I feel like I have a JD at this point, right? And there's been a lot from a legality standpoint that we've been navigating. And so we have committees across campus that are monitoring these things and are providing guidance around how they impact our areas of work, right? The Supreme Court decision on race-conscious admissions was a big one, and how we are now can understand that. And you're right in the essay, and in the same way we could think about a student's experience of how race has impacted kind of their perspective and such. It's the same thing. I was reading a student earlier today who was from a very rural area and then was attending a residential public school in a city, and how that impacted how she viewed kind of her experiences for the first time being out of her small community, her town of 2,000 people, right? That deeply impacted her and how she thinks about coming to a place like Hopkins. You can understand how that'd be valuable context for us to understand that student's perspective. And so, that's how, again, the rule of the law from the Supreme Court decision is that we cannot explicitly or implicitly take race into consideration, but people's experiences, absolutely we can think about that as and kind of who they are. Now, where we are now, I mean, we'll continue to monitor the interpretations of the law, but let me be clear, we intend to follow the law, right? To the utmost of our ability. And so that's kind of a guidepost for what we try to do. What I try to bring I try to bring this conversation back to, and this goes back to I mentioned earlier, kind of weeding through a lot of the noise in admissions. It hasn't changed my advice to students in this process, right? You all are still able to and should share any aspect of who you are, your identity, and your experiences in the application, right? It's on us and our burden to make sure that we are following the law and how we use that information. But this process has always been about kind of how you're sharing those aspects of who you are and all aspects of who you are. Again, we think about, as I mentioned earlier, different ideological viewpoints and across the political spectrum and socioeconomic backgrounds and geographic locations, and all that is how we understand diversity. Like race has gotten this hyper focus over the past handful of years, but we've always been focused on the various aspects of what makes you you, you know. So just make sure you're keeping that in mind and sharing that in our process.
Yeah, you kind of answered a question I was going to ask, which is like, as an advisor, well, let's speak to counselors for a second, because there are a lot of college counselors on the call who are wondering what happens when a student comes up and says, "Hey, can I write about race in my application?" Like, what advice would you give to those counselors who are dealing with this, with questions of students who are wondering, "Can I even bring, that aspect of myself in the application?"
Yeah, I would say one, I think that's why it's good for counselors to have relationships to ask gently, why do you want to talk about that? Do you feel like you have to talk about that because someone told you need to? Or do you not want to talk about, is it important to you? And do you want to share that with the college? It's an important aspect of who you are, right? I think there's, I had these conversations with students. I had one back in the fall, and a kid said, I just haven't had anything bad happen in my life. So I don't know what I'm going to write about my college essay. And he said it as like, that was a bad thing. And I'm like, that's amazing that you haven't had anything negative happen to you in your life or bad. You don't have to have these traumatic experiences to write an essay. I think some people think that that's what we're looking for. Like, no, we don't have prescribed things that we're, topics that we're looking for. The topic actually is not as important to us as how that experience has impacted you or what you've learned from that. And so I think really as a counselor, anchoring on what do you want the college to learn about you in this essay? Why do you want to talk about this? How is this a part of your story, right? I think that's what you want to focus them in on. If it all checks that this is why, it's all the right answers as to why I want to talk about those things. Absolutely, they should include that in their essay.
Yeah, there's a guide that we put together with a podcast that I recorded like a year ago or so called "Why You Don't Have to Talk About Trauma in Your College Essays," because so many students, right, have that perspective that it's funny. It reminds me of this New Yorker cartoon where there's this girl who's sitting by the window and she's like writing in her journal, and the caption is, "Dear Mom and Dad, thanks for the happy childhood. You ruined any chance I had of becoming a writer." And I think there's that perception, right, of like, well, if I didn't have that,
Mhm.
then if I, then you ruin any chance I had of getting into a good college, but it's just not about that.
Yeah.
Um, if you had to like crystal ball moment, because people sometimes, I don't know, are curious, what's changing, what's happening, what do you see coming? What do you see coming on the line? Like what's shifting? I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about the standardized tests, like what you see happening there a little bit, but like if you had to sort of look into your crystal ball in terms of where the profession is headed, where higher education is headed. Yeah, what do you see?
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, so I do a training for staff. So I think it's important to think about like where we've come from to figure out where we're going. And when you look at what has been, it's been louder more recently than in the past. But when you look at the history of higher education, the history of enrollment management, it's actually a pretty young profession. This type of intentionality around enrolling an incoming class is, I guess in our perspective, not that old, but like, in the 70s and 80s, it kind of came about. We've been focused on a lot of the same things, right? We've been focused on affordability, right? So I think that's going to be a big focus for colleges moving forward. It always pains me when people say college is wholly unaffordable. There are some affordable options out there. There are some affordable pathways. I think people make some expensive decisions. But for certain families at different places, that's part of your research. The value of a college degree, right? That troubles me deeply that there's this sentiment that college isn't worth it, right? So I think emphasizing and helping people understand the return on their investment when it is affordable to go to different institutions is big. And then we will continue to really look at how we are evaluating students, right? We have an admissions process that tries to create a framework for students all around the world, which is not possible, right? How do you identify these things when you have people who are coming from so many different perspectives? And so I think we will continue to have robust conversations about that, about standardized testing and the role that it plays, right? And even as some institutions return back to testing, there are a lot of institutions that are still test optional or test free. I think even for those schools like Hopkins that are returning to testing, we learned a lot about what standardized testing means in our process, how it is used to inform how a student may perform on our campus, right? So I think the research around what we're looking for, how we're identifying students that are going to be a good fit for our institution is still going to be very key. I think you will continue to see some more creative ways that colleges are trying to understand and learn about students, from essays, from videos that some institutions are doing, right? Trying to create ways that and really honor individuality, and that every student is different, and that students shine in different ways. So how do we think about that within our process? And so I think we'll continue to kind of work on that as well. But these aren't necessarily new things. These are things that our field has been wrestling with and trying to address for decades now.
Yeah. I'd love to stay on testing for just another minute because counselor, it's such a big thing that counselors talking about all the time. And I'd love for you to talk about, to whatever extent you're comfortable, about why Hopkins went back to testing, or that's too specific. Like, why do you think there are some, selective institutions that are going back to testing?
Yeah, I think the pandemic hit and it turned our world upside down. And out of necessity, colleges had to go, test optional. Most did, some remained. And then, we announced, most of those institutions were like, this is an opportunity for not only out of necessity, but for us to kind of, study how we would kind of navigate this moving forward. And ultimately, we learned a lot about the role of standardized testing in our process. It by any means is not the sole or the dominant factor as to why we admit students. But after significant research, my institution, and I want to be clear that this is just kind of where we landed, we felt that that piece of information can be helpful as we understand how a student may perform academically on our campus, right? One piece of information, a part of the whole pie, right? So that's why we landed where we landed with it. Now I feel like my job is to, try to reiterate with families that it is one piece of the overall pie. It's just one piece of the academics. What you're doing in and day out is going to matter so much more to us, right, than what you do on a Saturday for a few hours, right? So keep that in mind, right? As you're going through this process, and and as you're applying to colleges.
Yeah, I just want to plus one that point about it's one piece of the pie, especially testing, because this is one area where I actually wish more colleges, and I brought this up at NACAC or something, but having worked, at a selective college, I would see the entire score ranges that were admitted to the college.
Mm-hmm.
Families typically only see the 25th to the 75th percentile. So
Right.
obviously there's a bunch of kids who have above that. That goes without saying. But people wonder how many students are below that profile in the bottom 25%. I'm just talking math here. I'm not talking about value.
Yeah.
And I wish more colleges would kind of let families and communities know that idea of evaluating your transcript in context, what's available to you in your high school, what are other students doing here. It's the same for standardized testing, so if you're coming from an area you don't have as much access to prep, there's a lot of kind of ways that people in admissions take your score into context beyond just what it is. There's a lot of it tied to, your circumstances, your experiences. So I just want to put that out there to people that don't remove yourself from putting in an application solely because you see I'm slightly on the lower end of a range, because you never know. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, or whatever, some other basketball quote. And you lose nothing by applying other than potentially some time writing your application.
Yeah. Agree.
You miss 30% of the shots you don't take. Now, if you're me, you miss 50. Anyway. I'd love to just, will you talk to parents for a minute and just
Yeah.
like, what, what advice, okay, what you said, how many, you have a fourth grader, do you have an older kid? Or do
I
you
have
have
a fourth and a third.
fourth
They're
and a third
10 and
grade?
8.
Okay.
Yeah.
What advice do you want to give your future self that you hope that you will follow? So I was going to say just like straight
Yeah.
talk to parents, which you could.
Yeah.
But like, how do you hope to go through this process? So give yourself some advice 7 years from now. Or
Yeah. Yeah. I think, um, so when I started my admissions career, I would come across parents and I'm like, man, like they really need to, let the student kind of go about the process. Or man, I feel like they're kind of inserting themselves too much. And then I had kids, and I was like, oh, I get it. Uh-oh, right? And I even find myself creeping into some of these things that I know as a professional aren't healthy, right? So I do empathize with parents as we go through. Some piece of advice, and I remind myself about this every day. Right, when kids are born, we celebrate everything, right? We celebrate when they sit up. We celebrate when they roll over. A couple months ago, I went to a potty party when they celebrated when they were done with pull-ups, right? Like, and then as they get older, my fourth grader, I'm like, this is great that you're, are learning about distributive properties, but we need to get to differential calculus soon, right?
yeah, what else you got? What else you got? Yeah.
Yeah, what else you got, right? And then you just kind of start moving, and you don't celebrate and appreciate those things. I think that's harm and detrimental to young folks, right? When we set us up, and I think as adults we get into this what's next, what's next, what's next, not living in the moment. We started with gratitude. So I think that's the thing that I always want to hold true is like, how do I appreciate every moment? How do I celebrate every milestone? How do I reinforce with my children that I love them, right? How do I try? We all parents want kids to be happy, successful, and safe. And once I understood that, that helped me and how I interact with parents because that's ultimately what they're looking for. And so, how do we help them understand what that can mean for their student? Ultimately, they want the best for their kid, and so I think that's what drives us. I think that's an important one. Um, Allowing them to explore and discover is really important. I talked about that earlier, particularly from a major. In college, you don't go to college to find out what you want to do for the rest of your life. You pick a major, and that's what you study, and that's one aspect of the experience. So, I think that's a big one as well. Um,
Wow.
and I would say the other last thing I would say for family is like you just kind of have to, the college admissions process can be overbearing. And I think you just have to try to keep it in its place. Don't talk about college all the time. Carve out maybe an hour a week where you're doing that. I usually give this advice around holiday season. Redirect some questions. When Aunt Mary is coming to you and saying, "Hey, Calvin, what colleges are you looking at? What colleges do you want to go to?" Say, well, we haven't picked colleges yet, but these are the types of colleges that we're interested in, or the experience that we're looking for, right? Broadening it from names and getting hyper fixated on certain places. I think that provides a much more healthy college process.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I mean, there's a framework that's in my head that I feel inspired to share, which is like when we're looking at, let's say, our kids, are we counting up from zero in terms of like all that there is to celebrate, or are we counting down from
Yeah.
perfection?
Mhm.
And some, I don't know, conception in our minds of the way that things should be. Because I think that that's a huge, and this is true in relationships too, in any relationships, but it's like it just if you we can so easily switch that frame into like the sort of like, well, where you could be, what else you got, and it's so important to just count up.
Yeah.
Side note to parents and who are on this call, there's the next podcast that's coming up. It's going to be released on Tuesday. It's going to be like a specific resource, a specific exercise that parents can do to think about who do you want to be in this process. There's so much emphasis for students on like finding out who you are. I think parents, we can learn a lot about ourselves through this process
Yeah.
of who we want to be, especially at this key moment when we're getting ready to, in some ways, say goodbye for at least 4 years, but maybe in a bigger way. So um,
Yeah.
there's a specific resource there that y'all can check out. But I'd love to just hear from you, Calvin. What do you want to leave folks with as we kind of wrap our time here? What do you hope folks keep in mind as they're going through this process?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I think that and not to kind of go back to, the life design approach at Hopkins, but one of the tenets of it is that there are multiple successful versions of yourself,
Hmm.
right? I think students get fixated on like there's one career, there's one college, right? My favorite event to attend is move-in day.
Hmm.
Um, there are students where Hopkins was their first choice. that are moving in. There are students where Hopkins was not their first choice, but you can't tell them apart. Everybody's super
Oh,
excited,
nice.
right?
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. To quote another athletic reference, or one that I had when I was growing up, don't let a win get to your head or a loss to your heart, right? In this process, you're going to get some good news, some not so good news. And so I think it's just important to kind of keep that in mind and really focusing on, college is just kind of one step in your journey. It's not the destination. And so being thoughtful about like, where's my next step? What am I looking for in that next step? And when I get there, how am I making the most out of that college experience? I think is very key. And just to put a finer point on the parents, this is for you all who are getting towards the end of it and your kids will maybe go further away to college. Like, how do you want to spend the rest of this time with them, right? I think about that every day with my kids. I feel like the time has flown by. Think about that as you're having conversations, as you're spending time with them. Help them grow. I think another challenge we see is students are treated like kids until they're dropped off, and then they're expected to be adults, and they haven't been taught on how to be adults, right? So maybe teach them how to cook a couple of meals. Maybe they wake themselves up in the morning. Teach them how to separate their colors in their white clothes, right? Like I think those life skills, when you look, I do a lot of work with college success on our campus and the students who may be struggling. It's not in the ways that I think some people think. And I think as you're preparing them, from the academic and the co-curricular side, thinking about those adulting and life skills that are helpful and focusing on those as well.
Wow. As you say that, I'm like, two more questions pop into my head, but I hope that you'll come back sometime because like you said, the time flying by, like this time flew by. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think you've given a lot of wisdom, a lot of stuff for folks to think about. So thank you. Thanks for being here. And thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. And yeah, I would love to come back anytime.
Awesome. I appreciate you so much. And Tom, thanks for holding it down in the Q&A. How did we do in the Q&A, by the way?
Not as
Yeah.
good as you. I answered 37 and left 24 because I was like, oh, there's some that I think would be good to ask live, but I think we covered a lot of the points here.
Well, like what I'd love to do is what we'll probably do is like a little synthesis and I have this idea. I'm just going to say it to y'all live right now that I think it would be fun to at some point do an unofficial world record breaking moment of answering the most college admission questions in 1 hour. And because there are times, Calvin, where Tom and I will get in and one of us will be answering live and one of us is in the Q&A where we will answer more than like 100, 150 questions. And I don't know what the actual record is, but that might be kind of fun to team up on. So, because 37 is not bad. Like, that's funny that this is counting down from perfection. You're like counting down from like all the ones you did. 37 is pretty dang good.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thank you again. And y'all, I'm sorry we didn't get to the other 24, now 23 questions. But we look forward to having y'all on a future webinar. Stay tuned to the email list. We'll send you that. And again, thank you, Calvin and Tom, for being here. I appreciate you so much. And yeah, y'all have a blessed evening.
All right. Take care.
Thanks so much, Calvin. Thanks, Ethan.